Chapter 8 of Ronicky Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Ronicky Doone by Max Brand. Chapter 8. Two Apparitions. They found that the room in the house on Beekman Place, opposite that which they felt covered their quarry, could be secured, and they were shown to it by a quiet gentlewoman. Found a big double room that ran across the whole length of the house. From the back it looked down on the lights glimmering on the black East River and across to the flare of Brooklyn. To the left the whole arc of the 59th Street Bridge was exposed. In the front windows overlooked Beekman Place and were directly opposite the front of the house to which the taxi driver had gone that afternoon. Here they took up the vigil. For 4 hours one of the two sat with his eyes never moving from that street and the windows of the house across the street, and then he left the post and the other took it. It was vastly wearying work. Very few vehicles came into the light of the street lamp beneath them, and every person who dismounted from one of them had to be scrutinized with painful diligence. Once a girl, young and slender and sprightly, stepped out of a taxi about 10 o'clock at night and ran lightly up the steps of the house. Ronicky caught his friend by the shoulder and dragged him to the window. "There she is now!" he exclaimed. But the eye of the lover, even though the girl was in a dim light, could not be deceived. The moment he caught her profile as she turned in the open door, Bill Gregg shook his head. "That's not the one. She's all different. A pile different, Ronicky." Ronicky sighed. "I thought it was her," he said. "Go on back to sleep. I'll call you again if anything happens." But nothing happened that night, though even in the dull, ghost hours of the early morning they did not relax their vigil. But all the next day there was no sign of Caroline Smith in the house across the street. No face like hers ever appeared at the windows. Apparently the place was a harmless rooming house of fairly good quality. Not a sign of Caroline Smith appeared, even during the second day. By this time the nerves of the two watchers were shattered by the constant strain, and the monotonous view from the front window was beginning to madden them. "It's proof that she ain't yonder," said Bill Gregg. "Here's 2 days gone and not a sign of her. It sure means that she ain't in the house, unless she's sick in bed," and he grew pale at the thought. "Partner," said Ronicky Doone, "if they are trying to keep her away from us, they sure have the sense to keep her under cover for as long as 2 days. Ain't that right? It looks pretty bad for us, but I'm staying here for a solid week, anyway. It's just about our last chance, Bill. We've done our hunting pretty near as well as we could. If we don't land her this trip I'm about ready to give up." Bill Gregg sadly agreed that this was their last chance, and that they must play it to the limit. 1 week was decided on as a fair test. If, at the end of that time, Caroline Smith did not come out of the house across the street, they could conclude that she did not stay there. And then there would be nothing for them but to take the first train back west. The third day passed, and the fourth, dreary, dreary days of unfaltering vigilance on the part of the two watchers. On the fifth morning even Ronicky Doone sat with his head in his hands at the window, peering through the slit between the drawn curtains, which sheltered him from being observed at his spying. When he called out softly, the sound brought Gregg, with one long leap out of the chair where he was sleeping, to the window. There could be no shadow of a doubt about it. There stood Caroline Smith in the door of the house. She closed the door behind her, and walking to the top of the steps, paused there and looked up and down the street. Bill Gregg groaned, snatched his hat and plunged through the door, and Ronicky heard the brief thunder of his feet down the first flight of stairs, then the heavy thumps as he raced around the landing. He was able to trace him down the 3 flights of steps to the bottom. And so swift was that descent that when the girl, idling down the steps across the street, came onto the sidewalk, Bill Gregg rushed out from the other side and ran toward her. They made a strange picture as they came to a halt at the same instant, the girl shrinking back in apparent fear of the man, and Bill Gregg stopping by that same show of fear, as though by a blow in the face. There was such contrast between the two figures that Ronicky Doone might have laughed had he not been shaking his head with sympathy for Bill Gregg. For never had the miner seemed so clumsily big and gaunt, never had his clothes seemed so unpressed and shapeless, while his soft gray hat, to which he still clung religiously, appeared hopelessly out of place in contrast to the slim prettiness of the girl. She wore a black straw hat, turned back from her face, with a single big red flower at the side of it. Her dress was tailored gray tweed. The same distinction between their clothes was in their faces, the finely modeled prettiness of her features and the big, careless chiseling of the features of Bill Gregg. Ronicky Doone did not wonder that after her first fear her gesture was one of disdain and surprise. Bill Gregg had dragged the hat from his head, and the wind lifted his black hair and made it wild. He went a long, slow step closer to her, with both his hands outstretched. A strange scene for a street, and Ronicky Doone saw the girl flash a glance over her shoulder and back to the house from which she had come. Ronicky Doone followed that glance, and he saw, all hidden save a profile of the face, a man standing at the opposite window and smiling scornfully down at the picture in the street. What a face it was! Never in his life had Ronicky Doone seen a man who, in one instant, filled him with such fear and hatred, such loathing and such dread, such scorn and such terror. The nose was hooked like the nose of a bird of prey, the eyes were long and slanting like those of an Oriental. The face was thin, almost fleshless, so that the bony jaw stood out like the jaw of a death's head. As for the girl, the sight of the onlooker seemed to fill her with a new terror. She shrank back from Bill Gregg until her shoulders were pressed against the wall of the house. And Ronicky saw her head shake, as she denied Bill the right of advancing further. Still he pleaded, and still she ordered him away. Finally Bill Gregg drew himself up, bowed to her, and turned on his heel. The girl hesitated a moment. It seemed to Ronicky, in spite of the fact that she had just driven Bill away, as if she were on the verge of following him to bring him back. For she made a slight outward gesture with one hand. If this were in her mind, however, it vanished instantly. She turned with a shudder and hurried away down the street. As for Bill Gregg, he bore himself straight as a soldier and came back across the pavement, but it was the erectness of a soldier who had met with a crushing defeat and only preserves an outward resolution, while all the spirit within is crushed. Ronicky Doone turned gloomily away from the window and listened to the progress of Bill up the stairs. What a contrast between the ascent and the descent! He had literally flown down. Now his heels clumped out a slow and regular death march as he came back to the room. When Gregg opened the door, Ronicky Doone blinked and drew in a deep breath at the sight of the poor fellow's face. Gregg had known before that he truly loved this girl whom he had never seen, but he never dreamed what the strength of that love was. Now, in the very moment of seeing his dream of the girl turned into flesh and blood, he had lost her, and there was something like death in the face of the big miner as he dropped his hat on the floor and sank into a chair. After that he did not move so much as a finger from the position into which he had fallen limply. His legs were twisted awkwardly, sprawling across the floor in front of him, one long arm dragged down toward the floor as if there was no strength in it to support the weight of the labor-hardened hands. His chin was fallen against his breast. When Ronicky Doone crossed to him and laid a kind hand on his shoulder he did not look up. "It's ended," said Bill Gregg faintly. "Now we hit the back trail and forget all about this," he added with a faint attempt at cynicism. "I've just wasted a pile of good money-making time from the mine, that's all." Said Ronicky Doone. "Bill, look me in the eye and tell me man to man that you're a liar." He added, "Can you ever be happy without her, man?" The cruelty of that speech made Gregg flush, and he looked up sharply. That was exactly what Ronicky Doone wanted. "I guess they ain't any use in talking about that part of it," said Gregg huskily. "Ain't there? That's where you and me don't agree. Why, Bill, look at the way things have gone. You start out with the photograph of a girl. Now we've followed her, found her name, tracked her across the continent, and know her street address, and you've given her a chance to see your own face. Ain't that something done? After you've done all that, are you going to give up now? Not you, Bill. You're going to buck up and go ahead full steam, eh?" Bill Gregg smiled sourly. "Do you know what she said to me when I came rushing up saying I'm Bill Gregg? Do you know what she said? 'Well, Bill Gregg,' she says, 'I don't remember any such name.' That took the wind out of me. I only had enough left to say, 'The gent that was writing those papers to the correspondence school to you from the West, the one you sent your picture to and "'Sent my picture to?' she says, and looks as if the ground had opened under her feet. 'You're mad,' she says. And then she looks back over her shoulder as much as to wish she was safe back in her house. Do you know why she looked back over her shoulder? Just for the reason I told you. No, Bill, there was a gent standing up there at the window watching her and how she acted. He's the gent that kept her from writing you and signing her name. He's the one who's kept her in that house. He's the one that knew we were watching all the time, that sent out the girl with the exact orders how she should act if you was to come out and speak to her when you seen her. Bill, what that girl told you didn't come out of her own head. It come out of the head of the gent across the way. When you turned your back on her, she looked like she'd run after you and try to explain. But the fear of that fellow up in the window was too much for her, and she didn't dare. Bill, to get that girl, you got to get that gent I seen grinning from the window." "Grinning?" asked Bill Gregg, grinding his teeth and starting from his chair. "Was the skunk laughing at me?" "Sure, every minute." Bill Gregg groaned. "I'll smash every bone in his ugly head." "Shake," said Ronicky Doone. "That's the sort of talk I wanted to hear, and I'll help you, Bill. Unless I'm away wrong, it'll take the best you and me can do, working together, to put that gent down." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Ronicky Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney. Idaho, USA. Ronicky Doone by Max Brand. Chapter 9. A Bold Venture. But how to reach that man of the smile and the sneer, how above all to make sure that he was really the power controlling Caroline Smith, were problems which could not be solved in a moment. Bill Gregg contributed one helpful idea. "We've waited a week to see her. Now that we've seen her, let's keep on waiting," he said, and Ronicky agreed. They resumed the vigil, but it had been prolonged for such a length of time that it was impossible to keep it as strictly as it had been observed before. Bill Gregg, outworn by the strain of the long watching and the shock of the disappointment of that day, went completely to pieces and in the early evening fell asleep. But Ronicky Doone went out for a light dinner and came back after dark, refreshed and eager for action, only to find that Bill Gregg was incapable of being roused. He slept like a dead man. Ronicky went to the window and sat alone. Few of the roomers were home in the house opposite. They went out for the evening, or for dinner, at least, and the face of the building was dark and cold, the light from the street lamp glinting unevenly on the window panes. He sat there staring at the old house so many hours in the past that it was beginning to look like a face to him, to be studied as one might study a human being. And the people it sheltered, the old hag who kept the door, the sneering man, and Caroline Smith, were to the house like thoughts behind the man's face, an inscrutable face. But if one cannot pry behind the mask of the human, at least it's possible to enter a house and find. At this point in his thoughts, Ronicky Doone rose with a quickening pulse. Suppose he, alone, entered that house by stealth, like a burglar, and found what he could find. He brushed the idea away. Instantly it returned to him. The danger of the thing, and danger there certainly would be in the vicinity of him of the sardonic profile, appealed to him more and more keenly. Moreover, he must go alone. The heavy-footed Gregg would be a poor helpmate on such an errand of stealth. Ronicky turned away from the window, turned back to it, and looked once more at the tall front of the building opposite. Then he started to get ready for the expedition. The preparations were simple. He put on a pair of low shoes, very light and with rubber heels. In them he could move with the softness and the speed of a cat. Next he dressed in a dark gray suit, knowing that this is the color hardest to see at night. His old felt hat had been discarded before in favor of the prevailing style of the average New Yorker. For this night expedition he put on the cap which drew easily over his ears and had a long visor, shadowing the upper part of his face. Since it might be necessary to remain as invisible as possible, he obscured the last bit of white that showed in his costume with a black neck scarf. Then he looked in the glass. A lean face came back to him, the eyes obscured under the cap, a stern, resolute face with a distinct threat about it. He hardly recognized himself in the face of the glass. He went to his suitcase and brought out his favorite revolver. It was a long and ponderous weapon to be hidden beneath his clothes, but to Ronicky Doone that gun was a friend well tried in many an adventure. His fingers went deftly over it. It literally fell to pieces at his touch, and he examined it cautiously and carefully in all its parts, looking to the cartridges before he assembled the weapon again. For if it became necessary to shoot this evening, it would be necessary to shoot to kill. He then strolled down the street, passing the house opposite with a close scrutiny. A narrow, paved sidewalk ran between it and the house on its right, and all the windows open on this side court were dark. Moreover, the house which was his quarry was set back several feet from the street, an indentation which would completely hide him from anyone who looked from the street. Ronicky made up his mind at once. He went to the end of the block, crossed over, and turning back on the far side of the street, slipped into the opening between the houses. Instantly he was in dense darkness. For 5 stories above him the 2 buildings towered, shutting out the starlight. Looking straight up, he found only a faint reflection of the glow of the city lights in the sky. At last he found a cellar window. He tried it and found it locked, but a little maneuvering with his knife enabled him to turn the catch at the top of the lower sash. Then he raised it slowly and leaned into the blackness. Something incredibly soft, tenuous, clinging, pressed at once against his face. He started back with a shudder and brushed away the remnants of a big spider web. Then he leaned in again. It was an intense blackness. The moment his head was in the opening the sense of listening, which is ever in a house, came to him. There were the strange, musty underground odors which go with cellars and make men think of death. However, he must not stay here indefinitely. To be seen leaning in at this window was as bad as being seen in the house itself. He slipped through the opening at once, and beneath his feet there was a soft crunching of coal. He had come directly into the bin. Turning, he closed the window, for that would be a definite clue to anyone who might pass down the alley. As he stood surrounded by that hostile silence, that evil darkness, he grew somewhat accustomed to the dimness, and he could make out not definite objects, but ghostly outlines. Presently he took out the small electric torch which he carried and examined his surroundings. The bin had not yet received the supply of winter coal and was almost empty. He stepped out into a part of the basement which had been used apparently for storing articles not worth keeping, but too good to be thrown away, an American habit of thrift. Several decrepit chairs and a rickety cabinet and old console tables were piled together in a tangled mess. Ronicky looked at them with an unaccountable shudder, as if he had read in them the history of the ruin and fall and death of many an old inhabitant of this house. It seemed to his imagination that the man with the sneer had been the cause of all the destruction and would be the cause of more. He passed through the basement quickly, eager to be out of the musty odors and his gloomy thoughts. He found the storerooms, reached the kitchen stairs and ascended at once. Halfway up the stairs, the door above him suddenly opened, and light poured down at him. He saw the flying figure of a cat, a broom behind it, and a woman behind the broom. "Whisht! Out of here, dirty beast!" The cat thudded against Ronicky's knee, screeched, and disappeared below. The woman of the broom shaded her eyes and peered down the steps. "A queer cat," she muttered, then slammed the door. It seemed certain to Ronicky that she must have seen him, yet he knew that the blackness of the cellar had probably half blinded her. Besides, he had drawn as far as possible to one side of the steps, and in this way she might easily have overlooked him. In the meantime, it seemed that this way of entering the house was definitely blocked. He paused a moment to consider other plans, but while he stayed there in thought, he heard the rattle of pans. It decided him to stay for a while longer. Apparently she was washing the cooking utensils, and that meant that she was near the close of her work for the evening. In fact, the rim of light, which showed behind the door frame and the door, suddenly snapped out, and he heard her footsteps retreating. Still he delayed for a moment or two, for fear that she might return to take something which she had forgotten. But the silence deepened above him, and voices were faintly audible toward the front of the house. That decided Ronicky. He opened the door, blessing the well-oiled hinges which kept it from making any noise, and let a shaft from his pocket lantern flicker across the kitchen floor. The light glimmered on the newly scrubbed surface and showed him a door to his right, opening into the main part of the house. He passed through it at once, and sighed with relief when his foot touched the carpet on the hall beyond. He noted, too, that there was no sign of a creak from the boards beneath his tread. However old the house might be, he was a noble carpenter who had laid the flooring, Ronicky thought, as he slipped through the semi-gloom. For there was a small hall light toward the front, and it gave him an uncertain illumination, even at the rear of the passage. Now that he was definitely committed to the adventure, he wondered more and more what he could possibly gain by it. But still he went on, and in spite of the danger, it is doubtful if Ronicky would have willingly changed places with any man in the world at that moment. At least there was not the slightest sense of remaining on the lower floor of the house. He slipped down the shadow of the main stairs, swiftly circled through the danger of the light of the lower hall lamp, and started his ascent. Still the carpet muffled every sound which he made in climbing, and the solid construction of the house did not betray him with a single creaking noise. He reached the first hall. This, beyond doubt, was where he would find the room of the man who sneered, the arch enemy, as Ronicky Doone was beginning to think of him. A shiver passed through his lithe, muscular body as he thought of that meeting. He opened the first door on his left. It was a small closet for brooms and dust cloths and such things. Determining to be methodical, he went to the extreme end of the hall and tried that door. It was locked, but while his hand was still on the knob, turning it in disappointment, a door higher up in the house opened, and a hum of voices passed out to him. They grew louder. They turned to the staircase from the floor above, and commenced to descend at a running pace. 3 or 4 men at least there must be by the sound, and perhaps more. Ronicky started to the head of the stairs to make his retreat, but just as he reached there, the party turned into the hall and confronted him. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Ronicky Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Ronicky Doone by Max Brand. Chapter 10. Mistaken Identity. To flee down the stairs now would be rank folly. If there happened to be among these fellows a man of the type of him who sneered, a bullet would catch the fugitive long before he reached the bottom of the staircase. And, since he could not retreat, Ronicky went slowly and steadily ahead, for certainly, if he stood still, he would be spoken to. He would have to rely now on the very dim light in the hall, and the shadow of his cap obscuring his face. If these were rumors, perhaps they would take him for some newcomer. But he was hailed at once, and a hand was laid on his shoulder. "Hello, Pete. What's the dope?" Ronicky shrugged the hand away and went on. "Won't talk, curse him. That's because the plant went flooey." "Maybe not. Pete don't talk much, except to the old man." "Let me get at him," said the third voice. "Beat it down to Rooney's. I'm going with Pete and get what he knows." And as Ronicky turned onto the next flight of the stairway, he was overtaken by hurrying feet. The other two had already scurried down toward the front door of the house. "I got some stuff in my room, Pete," said the friendly fellow who had overtaken him. "Come up and have a jolt, and we can have a talk. Lefty and Monahan think you went flop on the job, but I know better, eh? The old man always picks you for these singles. He never gives me a shot at 'em." Then he added, "Here we are." And opening the door in the first hall, he stepped to the center of the room and fumbled at a chain that broke loose and tinkled against glass. Eventually he snapped on an electric light. Ronicky Doone saw a powerfully built, bull-necked man, with a soft hat pulled far down on his head. Then the man turned. It was much against the grain for Ronicky to attack a man by surprise, but necessity is a stern ruler. And the necessity which made him strike made him hit with the speed of a snapping whiplash and the weight of a sledgehammer. Before the other was fully turned, that iron hand set of knuckles crashed against the base of his jaw. He fell without a murmur, without a struggle, Ronicky catching him in his arms to break the weight of the fall. It was a complete knockout. The dull eyes, which looked up from the floor, saw nothing. The square, rather brutal face was relaxed as if in sleep. But here was a type of man who would recuperate with great speed. Ronicky set about the obvious task which lay before him as fast as he could. In the man's coat pocket he found a handkerchief which, hard knotted, would serve as a gag. The window curtain was drawn with a stout, thick cord. Ronicky slashed off a convenient length of it and secured the hands and feet of his victim before he turned the fellow on his face. Next he went through the pockets of the unconscious man, who was only now beginning to stir slightly, as life returned after that stunning blow. It was beginning to come to Ronicky that there was a strange relation between the men of this house. Here were three who apparently started out to work at night, and yet they were certainly not at all the type of night clerks or night shift engineers or mechanics. He turned over the hand of the man he had struck down. The palm was as soft as his own. No, certainly not a laborer. But they were all employed by the old man. Who was he? And was there a relation between all of these and the man who sneered? At least Ronicky determined to learn all that could be read in the pockets of his victim. There was only one thing. That was a snub-nosed, heavy automatic. It was enough to make Ronicky Doone sigh with relief. At least he had not struck some peaceful, law-abiding fellow. Any man might carry a gun. Ronicky himself would have been uncomfortable without some sort of weapon about him. But there are guns and guns. This big, ugly automatic seemed specifically designed to kill swiftly and surely. He was considering these deductions when a tap came on the door. Ronicky groaned. Had they come already to find out what had kept the senseless victim so long? "Morgan! Oh, Harry Morgan!" called a girl's voice. Ronicky Doone started. Perhaps, who could tell, this might be Caroline Smith herself, come to tap at the door when he was on the very verge of abandoning the adventure. Suppose it were someone else? If he ventured out expecting to find Greg's lady and found instead quite another person, well, women screamed at the slightest provocation, and if a woman screamed in this house, it seemed exceedingly likely that she would rouse a number of men carrying such short-nosed, ugly automatics as that which he had taken from the pocket of Harry Morgan. In the meantime, he must answer something. He could not pretend that the room was empty, for the light must be showing around the door. "Harry!" called the voice of the girl again. "Do you hear me? Come out. The chief wants you." And she rattled the door. Fear that she might open it and, stepping in, see the senseless figure on the floor alarmed Ronicky. He came close to the door. "Well?" he demanded, keeping his voice deep like the voice of Harry Morgan, as well as he could remember it. "Hurry! The chief, I tell you!" He snapped out the light and turned resolutely toward the door. He felt his faithful Colt, and the feel of the butt was like the touch of a friendly hand before he opened the door. She was dressed in white and made a glimmering figure in the darkness of the hall, and her hair glimmered also, almost as if it possessed a light and a life of its own. Ronicky Doone saw that she was a very pretty girl indeed. Yes, it must be Caroline Smith. The very perfume of young girlhood breathed from her, and very sharply and suddenly he wondered why he should be here to fight the battle for Bill Gregg in this matter. Bill Gregg, who slept peacefully and stupidly in the room across the street. She had turned away, giving him only a side glance as he came out. "I don't know what's going on. Something big. The chief is going to give you your chance with me." Ronicky Doone grunted. "Don't do that," the girl said impatiently. "I know you think Pete is the top of the world, but that doesn't mean you can make a good imitation of him. Don't do it, Harry. You'll pass by yourself. You don't need a make-up, and not Pete's on a bet." They reached the head of the stairs and Ronicky Doone paused. To go down was to face the mysterious chief, whom he had no doubt was the old man to whom Harry Morgan had already referred. In the meantime the conviction grew that this was indeed Caroline Smith. Her free and easy way of talk was exactly that of the girl who might become interested in a man whom she had never seen, merely by letters. "I want to talk to you," said Ronicky, muffling his voice. "I want to talk to you alone." "To me?" asked the girl, turning toward him. The light from the hall lamp below gave Ronicky the faintest hint of her profile. "Yes, but the chief. He can wait." She hesitated, apparently drawn by curiosity in one direction, but stopped by another thought. "I suppose he can wait, but if he gets stirred up about it, oh, well, I'll talk to you. But nothing foolish, Harry. Promise me that." "Yes." "Slip into my room for a minute." She led the way a few steps down the hall, and he followed through the door, working his mind frantically in an effort to find words with which to open the speech before she should see that he was not Harry Morgan, and cry out to alarm the house. What should he say? Something about Bill Gregg at once, of course. That was the thing. The electric light snapped on at the far side of the room. He saw the dressing table, an empire bed covered with green figured silk, a pleasant rug on the floor, and just as he gathered an impression of delightful femininity from these furnishings, the girl turned from the lamp on the dressing table, and he saw not Caroline Smith, but a bronze-haired beauty, as different from Bill Gregg's lady as day is from night. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Ronicky Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Ronicky Doone by Max Brand. Chapter 11. A Cross-Examination. He was conscious then only of the green-blue eyes, very wide, very bright, and lips that parted on a word and froze there in silence. The heart of Ronicky Doone leapt with joy. He had passed the crisis in safety. She had not cried out. "You're not," he had said in the first moment. "I am not who?" asked the girl with amazing steadiness. He saw her hand go back to the dressing table and open, with incredible deftness and speed, the little top drawer behind her. "Don't do that," said Ronicky softly but sharply. "Keep your hand off that table, lady, if you don't mind." She hesitated a fraction of a second. In that moment she seemed to see that he was in earnest, and that it would be foolish to tamper with him. "Stand away from the table. Sit down yonder." Again she obeyed without a word. Her eyes, to be sure, flickered here and there about the room, as though they sought some means of sending a warning to her friends, or finding some escape for herself. Then her glance returned to Ronicky Doone. "Well?" she said as she settled in the chair. "Well?" A world of meaning in those two small words, a world of dread controlled. He merely stared at her thoughtfully. "I hit the wrong trail, lady," he said quietly. "I was looking for somebody else." She started. "You were after?" She stopped. "That's right, I guess," he admitted. "How many of you are there?" she asked curiously, so curiously that she seemed to be forgetting the danger. "Poor Carrie Smith with a mob." She stopped suddenly. "What did you do to Harry Morgan?" "I left him safe and quiet," said Ronicky Doone. The girl's face hardened strangely. "What you are, and what your game is, I don't know," she said. "But I'll tell you this: I'm letting you play as if you had all the cards in the deck. But you haven't. I've got one ace that'll take all your trumps. Suppose I call once. What'll happen to you, pal?" "You don't dare call," he said. "Don't dare me," she said angrily. "I hate a dare worse than anything in the world, almost." For a moment her green blue eyes were pools of light flashing angrily at him. Into the hand of Ronicky Doone, with that magic speed and grace for which his fame was growing so great in the mountain desert, came the long glimmering body of the revolver, and holding it at his hip, he threatened her. She shrank back at that, gasping, for there was an utter surety about this man's handling of the weapon. The heavy gun balanced and steadied in his slim fingers, as if it were no more than a feather's weight. "I'm talking straight, lady," said Ronicky Doone. "Sit down, pronto." In the very act of obedience she straightened again. "It's bluff," she said. "I'm going through that door." Straight for the door she went, and Ronicky Doone set his teeth. "Go back!" he commanded. He glided to the door and blocked her way, but the gun hung futile in his hand. "It's easy to pull a gun, eh?" said the girl with something of a sneer. "But it takes nerve to use it. Let me through this door." "Not in 1,000 years," said Ronicky. She laid her hand on the door and drew it back. It struck his shoulder, and Ronicky gave way with a groan and stood with his head bowed. Inwardly he cursed himself. Doubtless she was used to men who bullied her as if she were another man of an inferior sort. Doubtless she despised him for his weakness. But though he gritted his teeth, he could not make himself firm. Those old lessons which sink into a man's soul in the West came back to him and held him. In the helpless rage which possessed him, he wanted battle above all things in the world. If half a dozen men poured through the doorway he would have rejoiced. But this one girl was enough to make him helpless. He looked up in amazement. She had not gone. In fact, she had closed the door slowly and stood with her back against it, staring at him in a speechless bewilderment. "What sort of a man are you?" asked the girl at last. "A fool," said Ronicky slowly. "Go out and round up your friends. I can't stop you." "No," said the girl thoughtfully, "but that was a poor bluff at stopping me." He nodded, and she hesitated still, watching his face closely. "Listen to me," she said suddenly. "I have 2 minutes to talk to you, and I'll give you those 2 minutes. You can use them getting out of the house. I'll show you a way. Or you can use them to tell me why you've come." In spite of himself, Ronicky smiled. "Lady," he said, "if a rat was in a trap, do you think he'd stop very long between a chance of getting clear and a chance to tell how he come to get into the place?" "I have a perfectly good reason for asking," she answered. "Even if you now get out of the house safely, you'll try to come back later on." "Lady," said Ronicky, "do I look as plumb foolish as that?" "You're from the West," she said in answer to his slang. "Yes." She considered the straight looking honesty of his eyes. "Out West," she said, "I know you men are different. Not one of the men I know here would take another chance as risky as this, once they were out of it. But out there in the mountains you follow long trails, trails that haven't anything but hope to lead you along them. Isn't that so?" "Maybe," admitted Ronicky. "It's the fever out of the gold days, lady. You start chipping rocks to find the right color. Maybe you never find the right color. Maybe you never find a streak of pay stuff, but you keep on trying. You're always just sort of around the corner from making a big strike." She nodded, smiling again, and the smiles changed her pleasantly, it seemed to Ronicky Doone. At first she had impressed him almost as a man, with her cold, steady eyes, but now she was all woman indeed. "That's why I say that you'll come back. You won't give up with one failure. Am I right?" He shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know. If the trail fever hits me again, maybe I would come back." "You started to tell me. Is it because of Caroline Smith?" "Yes." "You don't have to talk to me," said the girl. "As a matter of fact, I shouldn't be here listening to you. But I don't know why I want to help you. You are in love with Caroline?" "No," said Ronicky. Her expression grew grave and cold again. "Then why are you hunting for her? What do you want with her? "Lady," said Ronicky, "I'm going to show you the whole layout of my cards. Maybe you'll take what I say to headquarters, the man that smiles, and block my game." "You know him?" she asked sharply. Apparently that phrase, the man who smiles, was enough to identify him. "I seen him. I don't know what he is. I don't know what you are, lady, but I figure that you and Caroline Smith and everybody in this house is under the thumb of the gent that smiles." Her eyes darkened with a shadow of alarm. "Go on," she said curtly. "I'm not going to guess about what you all are. All I know is what I'm here trying to do. I'm not working for myself. I'm working for a partner." She started. "That's the second man, the one who stopped her on the street today?" "You're pretty well posted," replied Ronicky. "Yes, that's the one. He started after Caroline Smith, not even knowing her name, with just a picture of her. We found out that she lived in sight of the East River, and pretty soon we located her here." "And what are you hoping to do?" "To find her and talk to her straight from the shoulder, and tell her what a pile Bill has done to get to her, and a lot of other things." "Can't he find her and tell her those things himself?" "He can't talk," said Ronicky. "Not that I'm a pile better, but I could talk better for a friend than I can talk for myself, I figure. If things don't go right, then I'll know the trouble is with the gent with the smile." "And then?" asked the girl, very excited and grave. "I'll find him," said Ronicky Doone. "And?" "Lady," he replied obliquely, "because I couldn't use a gun on a girl ain't no sign I can't use it on a gent." "I've one thing to tell you," she said, breaking in swiftly on him. "Do what you want. Take all the chances you care to, but if you value your life and the life of your friend, keep away from the man who smiles." "I'll have a fighting chance, I guess," said Ronicky quietly. "You'll have no chance at all. The moment he knows your hand is against him, I don't care how brave or how clever you are, you're doomed." She spoke with such passion of conviction that she flushed, and a moment later she was shivering. It might have been the draft from the window which made her gather the hazy green mantle closer about her and glance over her shoulder, but a grim feeling came to Ronicky Doone that the reason why the girl trembled and her eyes grew wide was that the mention of the man who smiles had brought the thought of him into the room like a breath of cold wind. "Don't you see," she went on gently, "that I like you? It's the first and the last time that I'm going to see you so I can talk. I know you're honest, and I know you're brave. Why, I can see your whole character in the way you've stayed by your friend, and if there's a possible way of helping you, I'll do it. But you must promise me first that you'll never cross the man with the sneer, as you call him." "There's a sort of fate in it," said Ronicky slowly. "I don't think I could promise. There's a chill in my bones that tells me I'm going to meet up with him one of these days." She gasped at that, and stepping back from him, she appeared to be searching her mind to discover something which would finally and completely convince him. At length she found it. "Do I look to you like a coward?" she said. "Do I seem to be weak-kneed?" He shook his head. "And what will a woman fight hardest for?" "For the youngsters she's got," said Ronicky, after a moment's thought. "And outside that, I suppose a girl will fight hardest to marry the gent she loves." "And to keep from marrying a man she doesn't love, as she'd try to keep from death." "Sure," said Ronicky, "but these days a girl don't have to marry that way." "I'm going to marry the man with the sneer," she said simply enough, and with dull, patient eyes she watched the face of Ronicky wrinkle and grow pale, as if a heavy fist had struck him. "You?" he asked. "You marry him?" "Yes," she whispered. "And you hate the thought of him?" I don't know. He's kind." "You hate him," insisted Ronicky, "and he's to have you, that cold-eyed snake, that devil of a man?" He moved a little and she turned toward him, smiling faintly and allowing the light to come more clearly and fully on her face. "You're meant for a king of men, lady. You got the queen in you. It's in the lift of your head. When you find a gent you can love, why, lady, he'll be pretty near the richest man in the world." The ghost of a flush bloomed in her cheeks, but her faint smile did not alter, and she seemed to be hearing him from far away. "The man with the sneer," she said at length, "will never talk to me like that, and still I shall marry him." "Tell me your name," said Ronicky Doone bluntly. "My name is Ruth Tolliver." Listen to me, Ruth Tolliver. If you was to live 1,000 years, and that gent with the smile was to keep going for 2,000, it'd never come about that he could ever marry you." She shook her head, still watching him from a distance. "If I crossed the country and followed a hard trail and come here tonight and stuck my head in a trap, as you might say, for the sake of a gent like Bill Gregg, fine fellow though he is, what do you think I would do to keep a girl like you from a lifelong misery?" And he dwelt on the last word until the girl shivered. "It's what it means," said Ronicky Doone. "Lifelong misery for you. And it won't happen. It can't happen." "Are you mad? Are you quite mad?" asked the girl. "What on earth have I and my affairs got to do with you? Who are you?" "I dunno," said Ronicky Doone. "I suppose I'm a champion of lost causes, lady. Why have I got something to do with you? I'll tell you why. Because when a girl gets past being just pretty and starts being plumb beautiful, she lays off being the business of any one gent, her father or her brother. She starts being the business of the whole world. You see? They come like that about 1 in 10 million. And I figure you're that one, lady." The faint smile went out. She was looking at him now with a sort of sad wonder. "Do you know what I am?" she said gravely. "I dunno," said Ronicky Doone. "And I don't care. What you do don't count. It's inside that matters, and the inside of you is all right. Lady, as long as I can sling a gun, and as long as my name is Ronicky Doone, you ain't going to marry the gent with the smile." If he expected an outbreak of protest from her, he was mistaken. For what she said was: "Ronicky Doone? Is that the name? Ronicky Doone?" Then she smiled at him. "I'm within 1 ace of being foolish and saying, but I won't." She made a gesture of brushing a mist away from her, and then stepped back a little. "I'm going down to see the man with the smile, and I'm going to tell him that Harry Morgan is not in his room, that he didn't answer my knock, and then that I looked around through the house and didn't find him. After that I'm coming back here, Ronicky Doone, and I'm going to try to get an opportunity for you to talk to Caroline Smith." "I knew you'd change your mind," said Ronicky Doone. "I'll even tell you why," she said. "It isn't for your friend who's asleep, but it gives you a chance to finish this business and come to the end of this trail and go back to your own country. Because if you stay around here long, there'll be trouble, a lot of trouble, Ronicky Doone. Now stay here and wait for me. If anyone taps at the door, you'd better slip into that closet in the corner. Will you wait?" "Yes." "And you'll trust me?" "To the end of the trail, lady." She smiled at him and was gone. Now the house was perfectly hushed. He went to the window and looked down to the quiet street with all its atmosphere of some New England village and eternal peace. It seemed impossible that in the house behind him there were... He caught his breath. Somewhere in the house the muffled sound of a struggle rose. He ran to the door, thinking of Ruth Tolliver at once, and then he shrank back again, for a door was slammed open and a voice shouted, the voice of a man: "Help! Harrison! Lefty! Jerry!" Other voices answered far away. Footfalls began to sound. Ronicky Doone knew that Harry Morgan, his victim, had at last recovered and managed to work the cords off his feet, or hands, or both. Ronicky stepped back close to the door of the closet and waited. It would mean a search, probably, this discovery that Morgan had been struck down in his own room by an unknown intruder. And a search certainly would be started at once. First there was confusion, and then a clear, musical man's voice began to give orders. "Harrison, take the cellar. Lefty, go up to the roof. The rest of you take the rooms one by one." The search was on. "Don't ask questions," was the last instruction. "When you see someone you don't know, shoot on sight, and shoot to kill. I'll do the explaining to the police, you know that. Now scatter. And the man who brings him down I'll remember. Quick!" There was a new scurry of footfalls. Ronicky Doone heard them approach the door of the girl's room, and he slipped into the closet. At once a cloud of soft, cool silks brushed about him, and he worked back until his shoulders had touched the wall at the back of the closet. Luckily the enclosure was deep, and the clothes were hanging thickly from the racks. It was sufficient to conceal him from any careless search, but it would do no good if anyone probed, and certainly these men were not ones to search carelessly. In the meantime it was a position which made Ronicky grind his teeth. To be found skulking in a woman's clothes in a closet, to be dragged out and stuck in the back, no doubt, like a rat, and thrown into the river, that was an end for Ronicky Doone indeed. He was on the verge of slipping out and making a mad break for the door of the house and trying to escape by taking the men by surprise, when he heard the door of the girl's room open. "Some ex-pugilist," he heard a man's voice saying, and he recognized it at once as belonging to the man who had given the orders. He recognized also that this must be the man with the sneer. "You think he was an amateur robber and an expert prize fighter?" asked Ruth Tolliver. It seemed to Ronicky Doone that her voice was perfectly controlled and calm. Perhaps it was her face that betrayed emotion, for after a moment of silence the man answered. "What's the matter? You're as nervous as a child tonight, Ruth." "Isn't there reason enough to make me nervous?" she demanded. "A robber, heaven knows what, running at large in the house?" Murmured the man. "Devilish queer that you should get so excited all at once. No, it's something else. I've trained you too well for you to go to pieces like this over nothing. What is it, Ruth?" There was no answer. The voice began again, silken smooth and gentle, so gentle and kindly that Ronicky Doone started. "In the old days you used to keep nothing from me. We were companions, Ruth. That was when you were a child. Now that you're a woman, when you feel more, think more, see more, when our companionship should be like a running stream, continually bringing new things into my life, I find barriers between us. What is it, my dear?" Still there was no answer. The pulse of Ronicky Doone began to quicken, as though the question had been asked him, as though he himself were fumbling for the answer. "Let us talk more freely," went on the man. "Try to open your mind to me. There are things which you dislike in me. I know it. Just what those things are I cannot tell, but we must break down these foolish little barriers, which are appearing more and more every day. Not that I mean to intrude myself on you every moment of your life. You understand that, of course." "Of course," said the girl faintly. "And I understand perfectly that you have passed out of childhood into young womanhood, and that this is a dreamy time for a girl. Her body is formed at last, but her mind is only half formed. There is a pleasant mist over it. Very well, I don't wish to brush the mist away. If I did, I would take half that charm away from you, that elusive incompleteness which Fragonard and Watteau tried to imitate, heaven knows with how little success. No, I shall always let you live your own life. All I ask for, my dear, are certain meeting places. Let us establish them before it is too late, or you will find one day that you have married an old man, and we shall have silent dinners. There is nothing more wretched than that. If it should come about, then you will begin to look on me as a jailer, and don't." "Ah," he said very tenderly. "I knew that I was feeling toward the truth. You are shrinking from me, Ruth, because you feel that I'm too old. No, no." Here a hand pounded heavily on the door. "The idiots have found something," said the man of the sneer. "And now they have come to talk about their cleverness, like a rooster crowing over a grain of corn." He raised his voice. "Come in!" And Ronicky Doone heard a panting voice a moment later exclaim: "We've got him!" End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Ronicky Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Ronicky Doone by Max Brand. Chapter 12. The Strange Bargain. Ronicky drew his gun and waited. "Good," said the man of the sneer. "Go ahead." "It was down in the cellar that we found the first tracks. He came through the side window and closed it after him." That dropped him into the coal bin. Did he get coal dust on his shoes? Right, and he didn't have sense enough to wipe it off. An amateur, a rank amateur. I told you," said the man of the sneer, with satisfaction. "You followed his trail. Up the stairs to the kitchen, and down the hall and up to Harry's room. We already knew he'd gone there. But he left that room again and came down the hall. Yes, the coal dust was pretty well wiped out by that time, but we held the light close to the carpet and got signs of it." "And where did it lead?" "Right to this room." Ronicky stepped from among the smooth silks and pressed close to the closet door, his hand on the knob. The time had almost come for one desperate attempt to escape, and he was ready to shoot to kill. A moment of pause had come, a pause which, in the imagination of Ronicky, was filled with the approach of both the men toward the door of the closet. The man of the sneer said: "That's a likely story. I can show you the tracks." "You fool, they simply grew dim when they got to this door. I've been here for some time. Go back and tell them to hunt some more. Go up to the attic and search there. That's the place an amateur would most likely hide." The man growled some retort and left, closing the door heavily behind him, while Ronicky Doone breathed freely again for the first time. "Now," said the man of the sneer, "tell me the whole of it, Ruth." Ronicky set his teeth. Had the clever devil guessed at the truth so easily? Had he sent his follower away merely to avoid having it known that a man had taken shelter in the room of the girl he loved? "Go on," the leader was repeating. "Let me hear the whole truth." I stammered the girl, and she could say no more. The man of the sneer laughed unpleasantly. "Let me help you. It was somebody you met somewhere, on the train perhaps, and you couldn't help smiling at him, eh? You smiled so much, in fact, that he followed you and found that you had come here. The only way he could get in was by stealth. Is that right? So he came in exactly that way, like a robber, but really only to keep a tryst with his lady love. A pretty story, a true romance. I begin to see why you found me such a dull fellow, my dear girl." "John," began Ruth Tolliver, her voice shaking. "Tush!" he broke in as smoothly as ever. "Let me tell the story for you and spare you your blushes. When I sent you for Harry Morgan, you found Lochinvar in the very act of slugging the poor fellow. You helped him tie Morgan, then took him here to your room. Although you were glad to see him, you warned him that it was dangerous to play with fire. Fire being me. Do I gather the drift of the story fairly well? Finally, you have him worked up to the right pitch. He is convinced that retreat would be advantageous, if possible. You show him that it is possible. You point out the ledge under your window and the easy way of working to the ground, eh?" "Yes," said the girl unevenly. "That is—" "Ah," murmured the man of the sneer, "you seem rather relieved that I have guessed he left the house. In that case—" Ronicky Doone had held the latch of the door turned back for some time. Now he pushed it open and stepped out. He was only barely in time, for the man of the sneer was turning quickly in his direction, since there was only one hiding place in the room. He was brought up with a shock by the sight of Ronicky's big Colt, held at the hip and covering him with absolute certainty. Ruth Tolliver did not cry out, but every muscle in her face and body seemed to contract, as if she were preparing herself for the explosion. "You don't have to put up your hands," said Ronicky Doone, wondering at the familiarity of the face of the man of the sneer. He had brooded on it so often in the past few days that it was like the face of an old acquaintance. He knew every line in that sharp profile. "Thank you," responded the leader, and turning to the girl said coldly: "I congratulate you on your good taste. A regular Apollo, my dear Ruth." He turned back to Ronicky Doone. "And I suppose you have overheard our entire conversation?" "The whole lot of it," said Ronicky, "though I wasn't playing my hand at eavesdropping. I couldn't help hearing you, partner." The man of the sneer looked him over leisurely. "Western," he said at last, "decidedly Western. Are you staying long in the East, my friend?" "I dunno," said Ronicky Doone, smiling faintly at the coolness of the other. "What do you think about it?" "Meaning that I'm liable to put an end to your stay?" "Maybe. Tush, tush! I suppose Ruth has filled your head with a lot of rot about what a terrible fellow I am. But I don't use poison, and I don't kill with mysterious X-rays. I am, as you see, a very quiet and ordinary sort." Ronicky Doone smiled again. "You just oblige me, partner," he replied in his own soft voice. "Just stay away from the walls of the room. Don't even sit down. Stand right where you are." "You'd murder me if I took another step?" asked the man of the sneer, and a contemptuous and sardonic expression flitted across his face for the first time. "I'd sure blow you full of lead," said Ronicky fervently. "I'd kill you like a snake, stranger, which I mostly think you are. So step light and step quick when I talk." "Certainly," said the other, bowing. "I am entirely at your service." He turned a little to Ruth. "I see that you have a most determined cavalier. I suppose he'll instantly abduct you and sweep you away from beneath my eyes." She made a vague gesture of denial. "Go ahead," said the leader. "By the way, my name is John Mark." "I'm Doone. Some call me Ronicky Doone." "I'm glad to know you, Ronicky Doone. I imagine that name fits you. Now tell me the story of why you came to this house. Of course it wasn't to see a girl." "You're wrong. It was." "Ah!" In spite of himself, the face of John Mark wrinkled with pain and suspicious rage. "I came to see a girl, and her name, I figure, is Caroline Smith." Relief, wonder, and even a gleam of outright happiness shot into the eyes of John Mark. "Caroline? You came for that?" Suddenly he laughed heartily, but there was a tremor of emotion in that laughter. The perfect torture, which had been wringing the soul of the man with the sneer, projected through the laughter. "I ask your pardon, my dear," said John Mark to Ruth. "I should have guessed. You found him, he confessed why he was here, you took pity on him, and—" He brushed a hand across his forehead and was instantly himself, calm and cool. "Very well, then. It seems I've made an ass of myself. But I'll try to make up for it. Now what about Caroline? There seems to be a whole host of Westerners annoying her." "Only one. I'm acting as his agent." "And what do you expect?" "I expect you will send for her and tell her that she is free to go down with me, leave this house, and take a ride or a walk with me." "As much as that? If you have to talk to her, why not do the talking here?" "I don't know," replied Ronicky Doone. "I figure she'd think too much about you all the time." "The basilisk, eh?" asked John Mark. "Well, you were going to persuade her to go to Bill Gregg." "You know the name, eh?" "Yes, I have a curious stock of useless information." "Well, you're right. I'm going to try to get her back to Bill." "But you can't expect me to assent to that." "I sure do." "And why? This Caroline Smith may be a person of great value to me." "I have no doubt she is, but I got a good argument." "What is that?" "The gun, partner." "And if you couldn't get the girl? But see how absurd the whole thing is, Ronicky Doone. I send for the girl. I request her to go down with you to the street and take a walk, because you wish to talk to her. Heavens, man, I can't persuade her to go with a stranger at night. Surely you see that." "I'll do the persuading," said Ronicky Doone calmly. "And when you're on the streets with the girl, do you suppose I'll rest idle and let you walk away with her?" "Once we're outside of the house, Mark," said Ronicky Doone, "I don't ask no favors. Let your men come on. All I got to say is I come from a country where every man wears a gun and has to learn how to use it. I ain't terrible backward with the trigger finger, John Mark. Not that I figure on bragging, but I want you to pick good men for my trail and tell 'em to step soft. Is that square?" "Aside from certain idiosyncrasies, such as your manner of paying a call by the way of a cellar window, I think you are the soul of honor, Ronicky Doone. Now may I sit down?" "Sure." "Suppose we shake hands to bind the bargain," said Ronicky. "You send for Caroline Smith. I'm to do the persuading to get her out of the house. We're safe to the doors of the house. The minute we step into the street, you're free to do anything you want to get either of us. Will you shake on that?" For a moment the leader hesitated. Then his fingers closed over the extended hand of Ronicky Doone and clamped down on them like so many steel wires contracting. At the same time a flush of excitement and fierceness passed over the face of John Mark. Ronicky Doone, taken utterly by surprise, was at a great disadvantage. Then he put the whole power of his hand into the grip, and it was like iron meeting iron. A great rage came into the eyes of John Mark. A great wonder came into the eyes of the Westerner. Where did John Mark get his sudden strength? "Well," said Ronicky, "we've shaken hands, and now you can do what you please. Sit down, leave the room, anything." He shoved the gun away in his clothes. That brought a start from John Mark and a flash of eagerness, but he repressed the idea after a single glance at the girl. "We've shaken hands," he admitted slowly, as though just realizing the full extent of the meaning of that act. "Very well, Ronicky, I'll send for Caroline Smith, and more power to your tongue, but you'll never get her away from this house without force." End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Ronicky Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Ronicky Doone by Max Brand. Chapter 13. Doone Wins. A servant answered the bell almost at once. "Tell Miss Smith she's wanted in Miss Tolliver's room," said Mark. And when the servant disappeared, he began pacing up and down the room. Now and then he cast a sharp glance to the side and scrutinized the face of Ronicky Doone. With Ruth's permission, the latter had lighted a cigarette and was smoking it in bland enjoyment. Again the leader paused directly before the girl, and with his feet spread and his head bowed in an absurd Napoleonic posture, he considered every feature of her face. The uncertain smile which came trembling on her face elicited no response from Mark. She dreaded him, Ronicky saw, as a slave dreads a cruel master. Still she had a certain affection for him, partly as a result of many benefactions, no doubt, and partly from long acquaintance. And, above all, she respected his powers of mind intensely. The play of emotion in her face, fear, anger, suspicion, as John Mark paced up and down before her, was a study. With a secret satisfaction Ronicky Doone saw that her glances continually sought him, timidly, curiously. All vanity aside, he had dropped a bomb under the feet of John Mark, and some day the bomb might explode. There was a tap at the door. It opened and Caroline Smith entered in a dressing gown. She smiled brightly at Ruth and wanly at John Mark, then started at the sight of the stranger. "This," said John Mark, "is Ronicky Doone." The Westerner rose and bowed. "He has come," said John Mark, "to try to persuade you to go for a stroll with him, so that he can talk to you about that curious fellow, Bill Gregg. He is also going to try and soften your heart, I believe, by telling you all the inconveniences which Bill Gregg has endured to find you here. But he will do his talking for himself. Just why he has to take you out of the house at night before he can talk to you is, I admit, a mystery to me. But let him do the persuading." Ronicky Doone turned to his host, a cold gleam in his eyes. His case had been presented in such a way as to make his task of persuasion almost impossible. Then he turned back and looked at the girl. Her face was a little pale, he thought, but perfectly composed. "I don't know Bill Gregg," she said simply. "Of course, I'm glad to talk to you, Mr. Doone, but why not here?" John Mark covered a smile of satisfaction, and the girl looked at him, apparently to see if she had spoken correctly. It was obvious that the leader was pleased, and she glanced back at Ronicky with a flush of pleasure. "I'll tell you why I can't talk to you here," said Ronicky gently. "Because while you're under the same roof with this gent with the sneer," he turned and indicated Mark, sneering himself as he did so, You're not yourself. You don't have a halfway chance to think for yourself. You feel him around you and behind you and beside you every minute, and you keep wondering not what you really feel about anything, but what John Mark wants you to feel. Ain't that the straight of it?" She glanced apprehensively at John Mark, and seeing that he did not move to resent this assertion, she looked again with wide-eyed wonder at Ronicky Doone. "You see," said the man of the sneer to Caroline Smith, "that our friend from the West has a childlike faith in my powers of, what shall I say, hypnotism?" A faint smile of agreement flickered on her lips and went out. Then she regarded Ronicky with an utter lack of emotion. "If I could talk like him," said Ronicky Doone, "I sure wouldn't care where I had to do the talking, but I haven't any smooth lingo. I ain't got a lot of words all ready and handy. I'm a pretty single-minded sort of gent, Miss Smith. That's why I want you to go out of this house where I can talk to you alone." She paused and then shook her head. "As far as going out with me goes," went on Ronicky, "well, they's nothing I can say except to ask you to look at me close, lady, and then ask yourself if I'm the sort of gent a girl has got anything to be afraid about. I won't keep you long. 5 minutes is all I ask. And we can walk up and down the street in plain view of this house if you want. Is it a go?" At least he had broken through the surface crust of indifference. She was looking at him now with a shade of interest and sympathy, but she shook her head. "I'm afraid," she began. "Don't refuse right off without thinking," said Ronicky. "I've worked pretty hard to get a chance to meet you face to face. I busted into this house tonight like a burglar." "Oh!" cried the girl. "You're the man. Harry Morgan—" She stopped, aghast. "He's the man who nearly killed Morgan," said John Mark. "Is that against me?" asked Ronicky eagerly. "Is that all against me? I was fighting for a chance to find you and talk to you. Give me that chance now." Obviously she could not make up her mind. It had been curious that this handsome, boyish fellow should come as an emissary for Bill Gregg. It was more curious still that he should have the daring and the strength to beat Harry Morgan. "What shall I do, Ruth?" she asked suddenly. Ruth Tolliver glanced apprehensively at John Mark and then flushed, but she raised her head bravely. "If I were you, Caroline," she said steadily, "I'd simply ask myself if I could trust Ronicky Doone. Can you?" The girl faced Ronicky again, her hands clasped in indecision and excitement. Certainly, if clean honesty was ever written in the face of a man, it stood written in the clear-cut features of Ronicky Doone. "Yes," she said at last, "I'll go. For 5 minutes. Only in the street, in full view of the house." There was a hard, deep-throated exclamation from John Mark. He rose and glided across the room, as if to go and vent his anger elsewhere. But he checked and controlled himself at the door, then turned. "You seem to have won, Doone. I congratulate you. When he's talking to you, Caroline, I want you constantly to remember that." "Wait!" cut in Ronicky sharply. "She'll do her own thinking without your help." John Mark bowed with a sardonic smile, but his face was colorless. Plainly he had been hard hit. "Later on," he continued, "we'll see more of each other, I expect. A great deal more, Doone." "It's something I'm sure I'll wait for," said Ronicky savagely. "I got more than one thing to talk over with you, Mark. Maybe about some of them we'll have to do more than talking. Good bye. Lady, I'll be waiting for you down by the front door of the house." Caroline Smith nodded, flung one frightened and appealing glance at Ruth Tolliver for direction, then hurried out to her room to dress. Ronicky Doone turned back to Ruth. "In my part of the country," he said simply, "they's some gents we know sort of casual, and some gents we have for friends. Once in a while you bump into somebody that's so straight and square shooting that you'd like to have him for a partner. If you were out West, lady, and if you were a man, well, I'd pick you for a partner, because you've sure played straight and square with me tonight." He turned, hesitated, and facing her again caught up her hand, touched it to his lips, then hurried past John Mark and through the doorway. They could hear his rapid footfalls descending the stairs, and John Mark was thoughtful indeed. He was watching Ruth Tolliver as she stared down at her hand. When she raised her head and met the glance of the leader she flushed slowly to the roots of her hair. "Yes," muttered John Mark, still thoughtfully and half to himself, "there's true steel in him. He's done more against me in 1/2 hour than any other dozen men in 10 years." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Ronicky Doone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Ronicky Doone by Max Brand. Chapter 14. Her Little Joke. A brief 10 minutes of waiting beside the front door of the house, and Ronicky Doone heard a swift pattering of feet on the stairs. Presently the girl was moving very slowly toward him down the hall. Plainly she was bitterly afraid when she came beside him, under the dim hall light. She wore that same black hat, turned back from her white face, and the red flower beside it was a dull, uncertain blur. Decidedly she was pretty enough to explain Bill Gregg's sorrow. Ronicky gave her no chance to think twice. She was in the very act of murmuring something about a change of mind when he opened the door and, stepping out into the starlight, invited her with a smile and a gesture to follow. In a moment they were in the freshness of the night air. He took her arm and they passed slowly down the steps. At the bottom she turned and looked anxiously at the house. "Lady," murmured Ronicky, "there's nothing to be afraid of. We're going to walk right up and down this street and never get out of sight of the friends you've got in this here house." At the word friends she shivered slightly, and he added, "Unless you want to go farther of your own free will." "No, no!" she exclaimed, as if frightened by the very prospect. "Then we won't. It's all up to you. You're the boss. I'm the cowpuncher, lady." "But tell me quickly," she urged. I have to go back. I mustn't stay out too long." "Starting in right at the first," Ronicky said, "I got to tell you that Bill told me pretty much everything that went on between you two. All about the correspondence school work, and about the letters and the pictures." "I don't understand," murmured the girl faintly. But Ronicky diplomatically raised his voice and went on, as if he had not heard her. "You know what he's done with that picture of yours?" "No," she said faintly. "He got the biggest nugget that he's ever taken out of the dirt. He got it beaten out into the right shape, and then he made a locket of it and put your picture in it, and now he wears it around his neck, even when he's working at the mine." Her breath caught. That silly, cheap snapshot? She stopped. She had admitted everything already, and she had intended to be a very sphinx with this strange Westerner. "It was only a joke," she said. I didn't really mean to." "Do you know what that joke did?" asked Ronicky. "It made two men fight, then cross the continent together and get on the trail of a girl whose name they didn't even know. They found the girl, and then she said she'd forgotten. But no, I don't mean to blame you. There's something queer behind it all. But I want to explain one thing. The reason that Bill didn't get to that train wasn't because he didn't try. He did try. He tried so hard that he got into a fight with a gent that tried to hold him up for a few words, and Bill got shot off his hoss." "Shot?" asked the girl. "Shot?" Suddenly she was clutching his arm, terrified at the thought. She recovered herself at once and drew away, eluding the hand of Ronicky. He made no further attempt to detain her. But he had lifted the mask and seen the real state of her mind, and she, too, knew that the secret was discovered. It angered her and threw her instantly on the aggressive. "I tell you what I guessed from the window," said Ronicky. "You went down to the street, all prepared to meet up with poor old Bill." "Prepared to meet him?" She started up at Ronicky. "How in the world could I ever guess?" She was looking up at him, trying to drag his eyes down to hers, but Ronicky diplomatically kept his attention straight ahead. "You couldn't guess," he suggested, "but there was someone who could guess for you." Someone who pretty well knew we were in town, who wanted to keep you away from Bill because he was afraid." "Of what?" she demanded sharply. "Afraid of losing you." This seemed to frighten her. "What do you know?" she asked. "I know this," he answered, "that I think a girl like you, all in all, is too good for any man. But if any man ought to have her, it's the gent that is fondest of her. And Bill is terrible fond of you, lady. He don't think of nothing else. He's grown thin as a ghost, longing for you." "So he sends another man to risk his life to find me and tell me about it?" she demanded, between anger and sadness. "He didn't send me. I just came. But the reason I came was because I knew Bill would give up without a fight." "I hate a man who won't fight," she said. "It's because he figures he's so much beneath you," said Ronicky. "And besides, he can't talk about himself. He's no good at that at all. But if it comes to fightin', lady, why, he rode a couple of hosses to death and stole another and had a gun fight, all for the sake of seeing you when a train passed through town." She was speechless. "So I thought I'd come," said Ronicky Doone, "and tell you the insides of things, the way I knew Bill wouldn't and couldn't, but I figure it don't mean nothin' much to you." She did not answer directly. She only said, "Are men like this in the West? Do they do so much for their friends? For a gent like Bill, that's simple and straight from the shoulder, they ain't nothing too good to be done for him. What I'd do for him, he'd do mighty pronto for me, and what he'd do for me, well, don't you figure that he'd do 10 times as much for the girl he loves?" "Be honest with me," said Ronicky Doone. "Tell me if Bill means any more to you than any stranger." "No, yes." "Which means simply yes. But how much more, lady?" "I hardly know him. How can I say?" "It's sure an easy thing to say. You've wrote to him. You've had letters from him. You've sent him your picture and he's sent you his, and you've seen him on the street. Lady, you sure know Bill Gregg. What do you think of him?" "I think." "Is he a square sort of gent?" Yes." "The kind you'd trust?" "Yes, but—" "Is he the kind of man that would stick to a girl he loved and take care of her through thick and thin?" "You mustn't talk like this," said Caroline Smith, but her voice trembled and her eyes told him to go on. "I'm going back and tell Bill Gregg that down in your heart you love him just about the same as he loves you." "Oh," she asked, "would you say a thing like that? It isn't a bit true." "I'm afraid that's the way I see it. When I tell him that, you can lay to it that old Bill will let loose all holds and start for you, and if they's 10 brick walls and 20 gunmen in between, it won't make no difference. He'll find you or die tryin'." Before he finished, she was clinging to his arm. "If you tell him, you'll be doing a murder, Ronicky Doone. What he'll face will be worse than 20 gunmen." "The gent that smiles, eh?" "Yes, John Mark. No, I didn't mean—" "But you did, and I knew it too. It's John Mark that's between you and Bill. I seen you in the street when you were talking to poor Bill look back over your shoulder at that devil standing in the window of this house." "Don't call him that. Do you know of one drop of kindness in his nature, lady? Are we quite alone?" "Not a soul around." "Then he is a devil, and being a devil, no ordinary man has a chance against him. Not a chance, Ronicky Doone. I don't know what you did in the house, but I think you must have outfaced him in some way. Well, for that you'll pay, be sure. You'll pay with your life, Ronicky. Every minute, now, you're in danger of your life. You'll keep on being in danger until he feels he's squared his account with you. Don't you see that if I let Bill Gregg come near me, then Bill Gregg will be in danger of this same wolf of a man, eh? And in spite of the fact that you like Bill— ah, yes, I do. That you love him, in fact." "Why shouldn't I tell you?" demanded the girl, breaking down suddenly. "I do love him, and I can never see him to tell him, because I dread John Mark." "Rest easy," said Ronicky. "You'll see Bill, or else he'll die trying to get to you. If you're his friend, I'd rather see him dead than living the rest of his life plumb unhappy." She shook her head, arguing, and so they reached the corner of Beckman Place again, and turned into it, and went straight toward the house opposite that of John Mark. Still the girl argued, but it was in a whisper, as if she feared that terrible John Mark might overhear. In the home of John Mark, that calm leader was still with Ruth Tolliver. They had gone down to the lower floor of the house, and at his request she sat at the piano, while Mark sat comfortably beyond the sphere of the piano light and watched her. "You're thinking of something else," he told her, "and playing abominably." "I'm sorry." "You ought to be," he said. "It's bad enough to play poorly for someone who doesn't know, but it's torture to play like that for me." He spoke without violence, as always, but she knew that he was intensely angry, and that familiar chill passed through her body. It never failed to come when she felt that she had aroused his anger. "Why doesn't Caroline come back?" she asked at length. "She's letting him talk himself out, that's all. Caroline's a clever youngster. She knows how to let a man talk till his throat is dry, and then she'll smile and tell him it's impossible to agree with him. Yes, there are many possibilities in Caroline." "You think Ronicky Doone is a gambler?" she asked, harking back to what he had said earlier. "I think so," answered John Mark, and again there was a tightening in the muscles around his mouth. "A gambler has a certain way of masking his own face and looking at yours, as if he were dragging your thoughts out through your eyes. Also, he's very cool. He belongs at a table with cards on it, and the stakes high." The door opened. "Here's young Rose. He'll tell us the truth of the matter. Has she come back, Rose?" The young fellow kept far back in the shadow, and when he spoke his voice was uncertain, almost to the point of trembling. "No," he managed to say. "She ain't come back, Chief." Mark stared at him for a moment, and then slowly opened a cigarette case and lighted a smoke. "Well," he said, and his words were far more violent than the smooth voice. "Well, idiot, what did she do?" "She done a fadeaway, Chief, in the house across the street. Went in with that other gent." "He took her by force?" asked John Mark. "Nope. She slipped in quick enough, all by herself. He went in last." "Damnation!" murmured Mark. "That's all, Rose." His follower vanished through the doorway and closed the door softly after him. John Mark stood up and paced quietly up and down the room. At length he turned abruptly on the girl. "Good night. I have business that takes me out." "What is it?" she asked eagerly. He paused, as if in doubt as to how he should answer her, if he answered at all. "In the old days," he said at last, "when a man caught a poacher on his grounds, do you know what he did?" "No." "Shot him, my dear, without a thought, and threw his body to the wolves." "John Mark, do you mean—" "Your friend Ronicky, of course." "Only because Caroline was foolish are you going to—" "Caroline? Tut tut! Caroline is only a small part of it. He has done more than that. Far more, this poacher out of the West." He turned and went swiftly through the door. The moment it was closed, the girl buried her face in her hands. Chapter 14